Welcome back to the second part of Lecture 5. So this will be Lecture 5B on the latter prophets, and we're going to finish up the latter prophets right here. Unfortunately, we cannot take a look at all of the prophets, but we're going to take some representatives and look at them. And let me remind you that if you do want to watch the Bible Project videos, you can go into the slideshow that I'll post and click on these underlined words, and you'll be able to open up the Bible Project video for that one. So Amos. To give a little historical context for the prophet Amos, it's important to know that this was especially bad time for superficial religiosity or ritualism, if you want to call it. The political and religious were intertwined too much. And so these political leaders who were also religious leaders were relying on bribes. They were putting their confidence in their own military strength instead of on God. One line that Amos uses is that they worshipped with their lips, but their hearts were far from God. So this is the context in Israel in the northern kingdom when Amos prophesies to them. Amos was actually the first prophet of these latter prophets whose words became an Old Testament book. He prophesies early in around 760 BCE when the northern kingdom was still alive and well. Interestingly enough, Amos was not from the northern kingdom. He was a sheep herder and a dresser of trees from Tekoa, which is a small village in the southern kingdom, not too far from Jerusalem. So God calls him out of his rural life to go to the northern kingdom and prophesy to Israel about their sins. One of the major passages here in Amos that really captures his message to the people is in Amos 5. And here Amos is speaking on behalf of God, which is what the prophets normally did. I despise your religious feasts, God says to the people. I cannot stand your assemblies. Even though you bring me burnt offerings and grain offerings, I will not accept them. Though you bring choice fellowship offerings, I will have no regard for them. Away with the noise of your songs, I will not listen to the music of your harps. But let justice roll on like a river, righteousness like a never-failing stream. These words have been repeated throughout history. Martin Luther King Jr., many other people who fought for justice for the oppressed. And here, this is what Amos is doing. The rich and the religious are oppressing the poor, and then they go to church and they worship God like nothing's happening. And so Amos is angry on God's behalf and wants them to turn away from their injustice and their false worship and to come back to God. Hosea is another one of the earlier prophets. He's in the 8th century as well. If you get a chance to watch the video on Hosea, I would encourage you to do it. It's a fascinating story because this man, Hosea, is not just called to give or bring a message to the people. God calls him to live a life that is a prophecy to the people. So God calls him to marry a woman named Gomer, who it's unclear if she's a prostitute or if she's just a woman who is unfaithful and becomes unfaithful in her marriage to Hosea. But whatever it is, God tells Hosea to marry her, and they have children, and then Gomer leaves him and is unfaithful to him, and God tells Hosea to go get her back. To love her and to be faithful to her even when she has been unfaithful to him. And it is a whole life parable to show that this is God who is faithful. God is like Hosea, and the people of Israel are like Gomer. So we learn that no matter how unfaithful the people are, God will continue to be faithful because God loves them so much. So two important messages and images come out of here. We see God as a faithful, loving spouse, personified in Hosea's own life and the way that he interacts with Gomer. And then we also have this beautiful passage where God is described as a parent to Israel, parent who loved and sheltered and helped Israel get on Israel's feet and walk, and one who walks daily with them and helps them through hard times. So it's really beautiful images of God. A lot of people will look at the Old Testament and think that the God of the Old Testament is an angry, judgmental God. But when you read the prophets, you really don't get that picture. You see that the people are the ones that are unfaithful, and God is the one who remains faithful throughout anything that they have done to him. So it's a beautiful message, and I encourage you to check out the video if you have time. Isaiah is an interesting book to look at because it covers such a wide range of time, and it is a huge book as well. It has 66 chapters, and it spans all three crisis periods. So the Assyrian crisis in the 8th century, covered in Isaiah chapters 1 through 39. The Babylonian crisis in the 6th century is covered in Isaiah 40 through 55. And the Restoration crisis in the 4th and 5th centuries are in the last 10 chapters of Isaiah. It really, when we say it's a book of Isaiah, Isaiah was not alive for all of these centuries, but probably some of his words are captured in here, and then other prophecies as well throughout this whole time period were gathered together and put in a book that really encompasses all three of the really difficult periods for Israel in their relationship with God. Jeremiah is also one of the major prophets, so Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Ezekiel, and it's one of the more painful ones to read because Jeremiah just had a hard time. He was a prophet that was reluctant to become a prophet in the beginning, and I think because he knew his own people and he knew how they would respond to him. And he was not well liked when he started bringing the message of God to the people. He had to tell them that judgment was coming and destruction was coming to Jerusalem unless the people repented, unless they changed their ways. So the overarching theme of Jeremiah is really the message of sin, of how the people have turned from God. And then it's the message of punishment that's going to come. But in the end, Jeremiah also offers the hope that we see throughout the prophets, that there will be restoration after the punishment has happened to Jerusalem. Jeremiah is often referred to as the weeping prophet because he is always lamenting to God about, why is this happening to me? Why have you called me to do this? And he really faced a lot of tragedy in his life, thrown into a well, a cistern by his people, imprisoned, and just really not respected throughout his career. He really is a good example of how it's hard for people to speak truth into difficult situations, that it's hard for people to hear hard truths, and often the messenger is the one who faces the consequences. So Jeremiah had a hard time as a prophet, the weeping prophet. The last major prophet that we're going to talk about is Ezekiel. There's some amazing, fascinating passages in Ezekiel. He was called to be a prophet after he was in exile. He was taken in Babylonian exile, and he had to leave his home. But while he was in exile, God called him to be a prophet outside of the land of Israel, outside of the people, because they needed to hear a word from God. Here is a couple of verses that talk about the call and commissioning of Ezekiel. So Ezekiel's seeing a vision. I looked, and I saw a windstorm coming out of the north, an immense cloud with flashing lightning surrounded by a brilliant light. The center of the fire looked like glowing metal, and in that fire was what looked like 4 living creatures. Many of the images from the New Testament and Revelation and other places come from Ezekiel and Daniel, these sort of fantastic visions. But there are meanings behind these visions. Lots of people have tried to capture what this vision looked like that Ezekiel had. They all end up looking very futuristic. But really what is more important than what the vision looked like is what the vision stood for, what it meant. And so Ezekiel sees this circular moving throne, like with wheels or looking like a wheel. And the idea behind this was that this throne was the throne of God. And up until this point in Israel's history, they believed that the the presence of God resided in the temple. There in the Holy of Holies. First it was in the tabernacle and now is in the temple. But that presence of God was centered in the temple. Now the people have been scattered. Many of them are in exile. And they wonder, is God's presence still with them? Because the temple has been destroyed by the Babylonians. So where is God's presence? And this vision of this moving throne that kind of flies through the sky shows Ezekiel and the people that God's throne can move. It is not relegated just to the temple or just to Jerusalem, but God will be with God's people even in exile. And it's an extremely comforting picture for these people who are far from home and living under the reign of the Babylonians. So Ezekiel's vision here is strange, bizarre, but very important for the people to understand God and their relationship with this God that can be God anywhere. The gods of the other nations, they were gods of this particular areas, and when people would leave their land, they would worship a different god. But here we see God is the God of all lands, of all nations, and God's presence will be with God's people wherever they are. Another important image from Ezekiel is this one. In Ezekiel 36, God says, I will give you a new heart and put a new spirit in you. I will remove from you your heart of stone and give you a heart of flesh. And I will put my spirit in you and move you to follow my decrees and be careful to keep my laws. You will live in the land I gave your forefathers. You will be my people, and I will be your God. This echoes the covenant that God made with the people on Mount Sinai. But this is a different kind of covenant. It's God recognizing that the people are not following the covenant well. And so God says, I will put my spirit in you to give you the power to follow my laws. And you will continue to be my people, and I will continue to be your God. And this is a promise, really looking forward to how God is going to be with the people. And in the New Testament, we see in a new way when Jesus comes and brings his spirit. That spirit is what gives us the strength to follow God. And here God is talking about that spirit that will empower the people to follow God well. One of the famous images from Ezekiel is the vision of dry bones. If you wanted to look at this video later, you can, but it's just a representation of what Ezekiel sees. He sees these dry, dusty bones on the floor of a valley, and then God tells him to speak to the bones and prophesy, and then God will breathe new life into them, and these bones come together and become people, this army of God. And it really speaks to the power of Yahweh's restoration, that no matter how far away the people have gone from God, no matter how dead they are in their faith, or no matter if they're in Babylon, God can breathe new life into them, and they will be a people once again. So a huge message of hope for the people here in Ezekiel. And that will end our latter prophets. We'll see you again for the next lecture.